honor for being asked to share my experience with you, but most of all, I feel extremely happy because by doing this, I'm not only contributing to the education about domestic violence, but I'm also supporting one of the agencies that has made a difference in my life. I would like to start by saying that many people helped me during this journey, but just a few walked the extra mile, and that's exactly what made the difference. I came to this country a few years ago after losing my job in a well-known hotel management corporation in Dominican Republic. I had a bachelor's degree in hotels management, but at that time, I was very depressed. I did not have a good relationship with my father, and I had lost my mother a couple of years ago. And on top of that, I was single and in my 30s, which in my country, in Dominican years, that means you are way past your expiration date. So I came for a few months for a change of scenery, recharge, and come back again. But the months passed by, and I was still feeling sad with no motivation and no hope. My situation got worse when I started feeling extremely lonely, being away from my loved ones, my friends, my identity, my culture. It was in that vulnerable moment of my life that I met my ex-husband and father of my 2 children. He was from another state and was temporarily living in the area for work-related reasons. But what really made me look at him was his kindness. He presented himself as a gentle, respectful, and very humble man. I could observe that he was a family man, and even though he shared some issues from his past with me, that only makes me love him more because of his honesty. We got together very quick, and just a few months later, I had an engagement ring in my hand. Everybody in both families was very happy for both of us, and I rapidly started preparing for my dream wedding. Just 2 months prior to our wedding, we decided to live together and I became pregnant. But along with that discovery, I also found hidden bottles of whiskey inside his underwear drawer and underneath the kitchen sink, which confused me because every time we went out, he was drinking just iced tea. Once we were together, he started changing his ways. It started with calling me names when he was angry, like Scarface, and leaving me nasty voicemails if I didn't answer his phone calls right away. I also noticed that he was drinking whiskey and beers almost every day. Finally, I had enough and I confronted him. But he used the excuse of the pressure of our wedding, and I believed him. But everything continued the same. My own relatives noticed some red flags and warned me, but I guess I didn't want to believe it. It didn't make sense to me. I thought it was something temporary because after every kind of abuse, he would treat me like a queen the next day, like filling our living room with flowers or cooking for me. But after one of those arguments, I called his mother looking for answers, and that drove him crazy. That night, he became very aggressive against me. We had a very nasty argument, and I canceled our wedding. He then threw all my belongings out of my apartment and tried to choke me while he was calling me racist names. I had to call a relative to pick me up because I was afraid to call the police due to my immigration status. I came with a visa and we were just beginning the process of my petition. Unfortunately, I knew nothing about my rights and I wanted to avoid any problems affecting my status in this country. The next morning, I came back to the apartment to get the rest of my things and I found him drinking at 10 a.m. When I told him we had to pay back my family for the plane tickets they bought to come to our wedding, he went nuts. He had a baseball bat in his hand and destroyed my cell phone. He continued calling me all kinds of names and asked me to kill our son. "Why don't you stick a knife in your stomach and kill the bastard nigger," he said. Then he carried me and threw me on the floor and started kicking all my things, threatened me with kicking my stomach. At that time, I panicked and called for help. He later left the state but continued harassing me with messages threatening me with immigration, asking me to kill our baby or asking me to forgive him. His favorite quote was, "Why don't you come back to your third whole country full of rats?" Later, I found out that he had a history of domestic violence with former relationships. He even put a gun to his ex-wife's head once. As a result, I have to move in with relatives for a couple of months until I was able to rent an apartment the same day we were supposed to get married. Unfortunately, 3 months later, I had preterm labor and I had to be in bed rest for 15 weeks. Therefore, my relatives had to give me shelter again for the rest of my pregnancy. Unfortunately, 2 months later, after my son was born, I had to move to a homeless shelter in another town, and it was there when my journey began. In this shelter, I found the first worker who walked the extra mile. She treated me with so much dignity, empathy, patience, and support. She was an angel who came to me when I didn't even know where I was. I had applied for child support, which made my husband to start harassing one of my relatives again. When I found out, I had contact with him against my advocate's advice. When I asked him to leave us alone and told him that I ended up living in a shelter, he told me that he had looked for professional help, that he had changed, that he loved me, and that he wanted to be a father for our son. Of course, I believed him. We came back together, and right after we got married, he told me we had to move to Las Vegas, Nevada. According to the way I was raised, my culture, and my family, a woman always has to follow her husband. So despite all advices, warnings, and recommendations, my 4-month-old baby and I traveled 4 days in a train to be reunited with my loving husband on the other side of the country. But just days after I arrived, the nightmare started all over again. But this time, I had a baby with me. I was away from family and friends. I have no money. I have no means of communication. He shut off the cell phone service, and no immigration status yet because he refused to submit the petition. Weeks later, I found out I was pregnant again, which made things worse. One day, things got so out of control that I ran away from the apartment, and a neighbor called the police. Unfortunately, one of the police officers was rude to me in front of him, so he used it against me. Remember how racist the police is here in Las Vegas before you dare to call them again. Almost every day, he would take everything out of the cabinets or closets and threaten me with leaving us behind without paying the rent. He would throw cigarette smoke in our son's face to provoke me. He would harass me with nasty voicemails the whole day, accusing me of having sex with a black man while he was at work and threatening me with killing me if he caught me. He would wake me up in the middle of the night to tell me racist jokes. He even told me once that he belonged to the white supremacy. I was afraid of talking to anybody, and I would not even dare to watch Oprah or Bill Cosby on TV if I wanted to have a peaceful day. It was at that very moment that I experienced what's called helplessness, which in my opinion feels like staying in an empty and dark room alone. On one hand, I did not want to worry my family, who thought I was living a honeymoon life in Las Vegas with my loving husband. And on the other hand, I was living in another state where I didn't know who to call for help. But one day, I managed to call my family advocate from the shelter, who gave me the names of a few resources in the area. With that sole action, with that extra mile, she empowered me immediately. Her action made me realize that I was not the same person that I was before I went to the shelter. I was stronger, and reminded me that I was not alone and that there was help out there for me. So almost unconsciously, I started working on my safety plan. After a very nasty argument where my husband left in the middle of the night, taking with him almost everything, including the microwave, so I couldn't sterilize our son's bottles, I contacted his sister, and she sent her husband to pick me up and bring my baby and I safely to their home in a military base in Arizona. A couple of weeks later, I went to live with some relatives in Florida, where I could have peace of mind, resources, and loving support to develop my next plan of establishing my immigration status. When I was in the shelter and prior to getting married, my advocate told me about VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. So every night after putting my son to sleep, I would study the immigration website to learn how to meet the requirements to submit my self-petition as a battered woman, which I paid for with all the Christmas gifts our relatives gave us that year because I couldn't afford a lawyer. But the very first thing I did the day after I arrived to Florida was to contact the domestic violence hotline, and they referred me to a women's center in Melbourne. There I found my other angel, a victim advocate. She gave me so much support while I was trying to put a restraining order against my husband. This advocate not only would educate me about the legal process and refer me to therapy, but I found in her a sense of safety, hope, and reassurance during those long, hard, emotional, scary days in court, which were very overwhelming because I didn't know his whereabouts and I didn't know if he knew mine. 3 months later, I had to come back to Massachusetts, and by that time, I was struggling to find a safe place to live. I had to continue working in my immigration status, continue with the restraining order process, and I had to get ready for the delivery of my second son.